Oh, hello, and welcome to the Good Omens read-along. In this segment, I get to learn a little bit more about this little gem here, and we get to meet an unsavory character. Well then, shall we get on with it? Aziraphale, like many Soho merchants who specialized in hard-to-find books for the discerning connoisseur, had a back room. But what was in there was far more esoteric than anything normally found inside a shrink-wrap bag for the customer who knows what he wants. He was particularly proud of his books of prophecy, first editions usually, and every one was signed. He'd got Robert Nixon, asterisk, a 16th century half-wit not related to any U.S. president, and asterisk, and Martha the Gypsy, and Ignatius Sylvia, and old Otwell Binns. Nostradamus had signed, "To mine old friend Aziraphale with best wishes." Mother Shipton had spilled drink on his copy, and in a climate-controlled cabinet in one corner was the original scroll in the shaky handwriting of St. John the Divine of Patmos, whose Revelation had been the all-time bestseller. Aziraphale had found him a nice chap, if a bit too fond of odd mushrooms. What the collection did not have was a copy of the nice and accurate prophecies of Agnes Nutter, and Aziraphale walked into the room holding it as a keen philatist might hold a Muriatis blue that had just turned up on a postcard from his aunt. He had never even seen a copy before, but he had heard about it. Everyone in the trade, which, considering was a highly specialized trade, meant about a dozen people, had heard of it. Its existence was a sort of a vacuum, around which all sorts of strange stories had been orbiting for hundreds of years. Aziraphale realized he wasn't sure if he could orbit a vacuum, and didn't care. The nice and accurate prophecies made the Hitler diaries look like, well, a bunch of forgeries. His hands hardly shook at all as he laid it down on a bench, pulled on a pair of surgical rubber gloves, and opened it reverently. Aziraphale was an angel, but he also worshipped books. The title page said, "The Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Nutter," in slightly smaller type, being a certain and precise history from the present day unto the ending of this world, in slightly larger type, containing therein many diverse wonders and precepts for the wife, and in different type, more complete than ever yet before published, in smaller type but in capitals, concerning the strange times ahead, in slightly desperate italics, and events of a wonderful nature, in a larger type once more, reminiscent of Nostradamus at his best. Ursula Shipton. The prophecies were numbered, and there were more than 4,000 of them. Steady, steady, Aziraphale muttered to himself. He went into the little kitchenette and made himself some cocoa, and took some deep breaths. Then he came back and read a prophecy at random. 40 minutes later, the cocoa was still untouched. Ooh. The red-haired woman in the corner of the hotel bar was the most successful war correspondent in the world. She now had a passport in the name of Carmine Zwegeber, and she went where the wars were. Well, more or less. Actually, she went where the wars weren't. She had already been where the wars were. She was not well known, except where it counted. Get half a dozen war correspondents together in an airport bar, and the conversation will, like a compass orienting to north, swing around to Murchison of the New York Times, to Van Horn of Newsweek, to Anforth of ITN News. The war correspondents. But when Murchison and Van Horn and Anforth run into each other in a burnt-out tin shack in Beirut or Afghanistan or Sudan, after they admired each other's scars and had downed a few, they would exchange odd anecdotes of Red Zwegeber from the National World Weekly. "That dumb rag," Murchison would say, "it doesn't goddamn know what it's goddamn got." Actually, the National World Weekly did know just what it had got. It had a war correspondent. It just didn't know why or what to do with one now that it had her. A typical National World Weekly would tell the world how Jesus' face was seen on a Big Mac bun bought by someone from Des Moines with an artist's impression of the bun. How Elvis Presley was recently sighted working in a burger lord in Des Moines. How listening to Elvis records cured a Des Moines housewife's cancer. How the spate of werewolves infesting the Midwest are offspring of noble pioneer women raped by Bigfoot, and that Elvis was taken by space aliens in 1976 because he was too good for this world. Asterix. Remarkably, one of these stories is indeed true. And asterix. That was the National World Weekly. They sold 4 million copies a week, and they needed a war correspondent like they needed an exclusive interview with the Secretary General of the United Nations. Asterix. The interview was done in 1983 and went as follows. Question. You're the Secretary General of the United Nations, then? Answer. C. Question. Ever sighted Elvis? And asterix. So they paid Red Zwigeber a great deal of money to go and find wars, and ignored the bulging, badly typed envelopes she sent them occasionally from around the globe to justify her generally fairly reasonable expenses claims. They felt justified in this because, as they saw it, she really wasn't a very good war correspondent, although she was undoubtedly the most attractive. Which counted for a lot on the National World Weekly. Her war reports were always about a bunch of guys shooting each other, with no real understanding of the wider political ramifications, and more importantly, no human interest. Occasionally they would hand one of her stories over to a rewrite man to fix up. Jesus appeared to a 9-year-old Manuel Gonzalez during a pitched battle on the Rio Concorsa and told him to go home because his mother worried about him. I knew it was Jesus, said the brave little child, because he looked like he did when his picture miraculously appeared on my sandwich box. Mostly the National World Weekly left her alone and carefully filed her stories in the rubbish bin. Mergenson and Van Horn and Anforth didn't care about this. All they knew was that whenever a war broke out, Miss Zwigeber was there first. Practically before. How does she do it? They would ask each other incredulously. How the hell does she do it? And their eyes would meet and silently say, if she was a car, she'd been made by Ferrari. She's the kind of woman you'd expect to see as a beautiful consort to the corrupt generalissimo of a collapsing third world country, and she hangs around with guys like us. We're lucky guys, right? Miss Zwigeber just smiled and bought another round of drinks for everybody on the National World Weekly, and watched the fights break out around her, and smiled. She had been right. Journalism suited her. Even so, everyone needs a holiday, and Red Zwigeber was on her first in 11 years. She was on a small Mediterranean island, which made its money from the tourist trade, and that itself was odd. Red looked to be the kind of woman who, if she took a holiday on any island smaller than Australia, would be doing so because she was friends with the man who owned it. And had you told any islander a month before that war was coming, he would have laughed at you and tried to sell you a raffia work wine holder or a picture of the bay done in seashells. That was then. This was now. Now a deep religio-political divide concerning which of the 4 small mainland countries they weren't actually a part of had split the country into 3 factions, destroyed the statue of Santa Maria in the town square, and done for the tourist trade. Red Zwigeber sat in the bar of the Hotel de Palomar de Sol, drinking what passed for a cocktail. In one corner a tired pianist played, and a waiter in a toupee crooned into a microphone. Ah, once upon a time there was a little white boy. Ah, very sad because he was a little white boy. A man threw himself through a window, a knife between his teeth, and a Kalashnikov automatic rifle in one hand and a grenade in the other. I claim this hotel in the beginning of the... He paused. He took the knife out of his mouth and began again. I claim this hotel in the name of the pro-Turkish liberation faction. The last 2 holiday-makers remaining on the island, Asterix, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Threlfall, of 9, The Elms, Pegington, They always maintained that one of the nice things about going on holidays was not having to read the newspapers or listen to the news, just getting away from it all, really. And due to a tummy bug contracted by Mr. Threlfall and Mrs. Threlfall's rather overdoing it in the sun their first day, this was the first time out of their hotel room for a week and a half. And asterisks. Climbed underneath their table. Red unconcernedly withdrew the maraschino cherry from her drink, put it to her scarlet lips, and sucked it slowly off its stick in a way that made several men in the room break into a cold sweat. The pianist stood up, reached into his piano, and pulled out a vintage submachine gun. "This hotel has already been claimed by the pro-Greek Territorial Brigade," he screamed. "Make one false move, and I shoot out your living daylight." There was a motion at the door. A huge black-bearded individual with a golden smile and a genuine antique Gatling gun stood there with a cohort of equally huge, although less impressively armed, men behind him. "This strategically important hotel, for years a symbol of the fascist imperialist Turco-Greek running dog tourist trade, is now the property of the Italo-Maltese freedom fighters," he boomed affably. "Now we kill everybody." "Rubbish," said the pianist. "It's not strategically important, just has an extremely well-stocked wine cellar." "He's right, Pedro," said the man with the Kalashnikov. "That's why my lot wanted it." "Il General Ernesto de Montoya said to me," he said, "Fernando, the war will be over by Saturday, and the lads will be wanting a good time. Pop down to the Hotel de Palomar del Sol and claim it as booty, will you?" The bearded man turned red. "It's bloody important strategically, Fernando Chinanti. I drew big map of the island, and is right in the middle, which makes it pretty bloody and strategically important, I can tell you." "Ha!" said Fernando. "You might as well say that just because little Diego's house has a view of the decadent capitalist topless private beach, that it's strategically important." The pianist blushed a deep red. "Our lot got that this morning," he admitted. There was silence. In the silence was a faint silken rasping. Red had uncrossed her legs. The pianist's Adam's apple bobbed up and down. "Well, it's pretty strategically important," he managed, trying to ignore the woman on the bar stool. "I mean, if someone landed a submarine on it, you'd want to be somewhere where you could see it all." Silence. "Well, it's a lot more strategically important than this hotel anyway," he finished. Pedro coughed ominously. "The next person who says anything at all, is dead." He grinned, hefted his gun. "Right, now, everyone against the far wall." Nobody moved. They weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to a low, indistinct murmuring from the hallway behind him, quiet and monotonous. There was some shuffling among the cohort in the doorway. They seemed to be doing their best to stand firm, but they were being inexorably edged out of the way by the muttering, which had begun to resolve itself into audible phrases. "Don't mind me, gents. What a night, eh? 3 times round the island, nearly didn't find the place. Someone doesn't believe in signposts, eh? Still found it in the end. Had to stop and ask 4 times. Finally asked at the post office. They always know at the post office. Had to draw me a map, though. Got it here somewhere." Sliding serenely past the men with guns, like a pike through a trout pond, came a small, bespectacled man in a blue uniform, carrying a long, thin, brown, paper-wrapped parcel tied with a string. His sole concession to the climate were his open-toed brown plastic sandals, although the green woolen socks he had worn underneath them had shown his deep and natural distrust of foreign weather. He had a peaked cap on with International Express written on it, in large white letters. He was unarmed, but no one touched him. No one even pointed a gun at him. They just stared. The little man looked around the room, scanning the faces, and then looking back down at his clipboard. Then he walked straight over to Red, still sitting on her bar stool. "Package for you, miss," he said. Red took it and began to untie the string. The International Expressman coughed discreetly and presented the journalist with a well-thumbed receipt pad and a yellow plastic ballpoint pen attached to the clipboard by a piece of string. "You have to sign for it, miss. Just here. Print your full name over here, signature down here." "Of course." Red signed the receipt pad, illegibly, then printed her name. The name she wrote was not Carmine Zweigber. It was a much shorter name. The man thanked her kindly and made his way out, muttering, "Lovely place you've got here, gents. Always meant to come out here on holiday. Sorry to trouble you. Excuse me, sir." And he passed out of their lives as serenely as he had come. Red finished opening the parcel. People began to edge around her to get a better look. Inside the package was a large sword. She examined it. It was a very straightforward sword, long and sharp. It looked both old and unused, and it had nothing ornamental or impressive about it. This was no magical sword, no mystic weapon of power and might. It was very obviously a sword created to slice, chop, cut, preferably kill, but failing that, irreparably maim a very large number of people indeed. It had an indefinable aura of hatred and menace. Red clasped the hilt in her exquisitely manicured hand and held it up to eye level. The blade glinted. "All right," she said, stepping down from the stool. "Finally!" She finished the drink, hefted the sword over one shoulder, and looked around at the puzzled factions, who now encircled her completely. "Sorry to run out on you chaps," she said. "Would love to stay and get to know you better." The men in the room suddenly realized that they didn't want to know her better. She was beautiful, but she was beautiful in the way a forest fire was beautiful. Something to be admired from a distance, not up close. And she held her sword, and she smiled like a knife. There were a number of guns in that room, and slowly, trembling, they were focused on her chest and her back and head. They encircled her completely. "Don't move!" croaked Pedro. Everybody else nodded. Red shrugged. She began to walk forward. Every finger on every trigger tightened almost of its own accord. Lead and the smell of cordite filled the air. Red's cocktail glass smashed in her hand. The room's remaining mirrors exploded in lethal shards. Part of the ceiling fell down. And then it was over. Carmine Zweigber turned and stared at the bodies surrounding her as if she hadn't the faintest idea how they came to be there. She licked the spatter of blood, someone else's, from the back of her hand with a scarlet cat-like tongue. Then she smiled. And she walked out of the bar, her heels clicking on the tiles like the tapping of distant hammers. The two holidaymakers climbed out from under the table and surveyed the carnage. "This wouldn't have happened if we'd gone to Tormilio's like we usually do," said one of them plaintively. "Foreigners," sighed the other. "They're not like us, Patricia." "That settles it, then. Next year we go to Brighton," said Miss Threlfall, completely missing the significance of what had just happened. It meant there wouldn't be any next year. It rather lowered the odds of there being any next week to speak of.
Well, wasn't that delightful? There's plenty more ahead in the playlist to come, and we will be seeing each other again. But until then, everything is tickety-boo. Mind as you go.